Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second half of this conference in association with the ATU, and thanks once again to our sponsors. Our next speaker is Danny McCoy, Chief Executive of IBEC, and Danny will talk this morning on the transformative power of digital innovation. Danny McCoy.
Aidan, thank you very much for the introduction. Anne, Maria and the organisers, very much appreciate the invitation here today, and very nice to see the campus here in Castlebar as well. By way of just introduction, maybe to contextualise where my perspective will come on this topic, because digital innovation wouldn't be my strength, and it was great to hear the information earlier on in the transformative power, often at the individual level, but be it at business, at the household, the individual. My remarks will be more collective in the power of the digital transformation in our macroeconomy, but also in our society and some of the factors behind that. As I said, it's very nice to be in Castlebar. I'm actually from Tuam originally, which is really just Mayo out for a good time. And the feature of being here as well in Mayo is just the scale of the business footprint in Mayo, which is underappreciated, I think, even locally, but certainly underappreciated nationally when you consider the really large scale of companies like AbbVie with the Botox, Coca-Cola with the concentrates, and then a whole host of really great brands like Port West, Smiths, McHale Engineering, Baxter, Hollister. It's really a phenomenal concentration of industrialization. And so industrialization 4.0 is often talked about. The exemplar of Industrial 4.0 is actually the western seaboard of Ireland. From Donegal and Letterkenny as a hub, right down to the medtech in Galway, all the way along through the now very vibrant engineering traditions in Limerick and into Killarney with Lieber, and then into the biopharma in Cork. These are powerhouses that underpin our society and underpin the economic progress. And it's pretty much devoid from a Dublin perspective, because every time the word rural is mentioned, people think it's farming. And most people, whilst farming is very significant in agri-food, a very significant driver in our economy, we also know that most people outside of the urban areas, their livelihoods actually depend on the industrial base, be it in medtech, or all the ancillary services around the digital marketing we've just been talking about the legals, about the taxation, and so on. This is a very modern, sophisticated economy, and part of that transformation that'll be very significant for the next wave will be the digitalization. That means that distance, which would have been something that bedeviled Ireland as a country itself, and the west of Ireland in particular, can be transformed and is being transformed. That distance now doesn't matter, but it does depend on a number of factors of which I'd like to draw upon. My own background is as an economist, and you'll see quite a lot of what I want to say about this is actually from an economics backdrop, but it's kind of very much more a fundamental issue, which I think can get lost in the excitement and the opportunity that digital transformation is bringing to our societies, and aspects of that like AI and so on as well. Bring those opportunities, but there is very significant uncertainty and fear on this particular technology as well, in terms of what it's going to do for livelihoods and its disruptive power. And I want to both simultaneously give some optimism on that, and also to highlight just a couple of the factors that I think we need collectively to understand, so we can harness this power and the transformative power of digital innovation for our society in a world in which everything now is contestable. The natural barriers of geography are breaking down to an extent. To try to maybe give context from where I'm observing some of these trends, I'm sure a lot of people won't know what IBEC is. IBEC is the Irish Business and Employers Confederation. So it's the largest business representative organisation in Ireland by a significant factor. It's also the largest lobbying organisation in the country as well by another significant factor compared to other parts of society, be it the trade union movement or the farming lobby or whatever. And so IBEC itself, and as the CEO of IBEC is quite a significant business. One of the largest of our types in Europe. In fact, of our type, we are the largest. Because we represent the business model which has grown dramatically in Ireland. And I'll give some of those facts in a moment. But IBEC itself, I'm the CEO of 360 people. We've got 10 locations. We own 39 brands. And our turnover is 52 million euros a year. So not alone do I give voice and represent business, and we do so, we also are a business. And we're a business in those 10 locations with offices in Dublin is our biggest, but we're in Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Galway, Donegal, Town, Letterkenny, Athlone. And so I go around quite a lot, so I see the transformative power of the business model in Ireland over the last half a generation, predicated as it was on the educational footprint provided by ATU. But I also see those issues in those towns and cities in terms of cost base, in terms of access to talent, in terms of trying to deal with some of the problems we hear day in, day out. But these are just noisy problems. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but they're kind of noise. They come, they go in out of fashion and so on. I want to talk about something much more fundamental, and something that doesn't change and won't change as a result of AI or any transformative technology. And that is that at the root of all of this is people. Now, I'm going to try not to get maudlin because that would be very bad luck for a business leader to have any sentiment at all or any heart, but I will come back to heart a little later on. And so, fundamentally, people don't change. Evolution is not that fast. We would recognize each other from 1,000 years ago. We're living longer, which is a great news. We're living healthier lives. We've got more opportunities for leisure, more opportunities for self-actualization because we've taken care of the kind of primary needs of shelter and food and so on. And we've moved into self-esteem and self-actualization and a kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Technology is a facilitator, but it can also be a disruptor. But fundamentally, and this is where I draw on my economics, is fundamentally you're looking at people who either go out in their home life, in their work life, or in their citizen's life. We're all part of the same cohort in different formations, be it as citizens in our talk about the government and the public service, or in terms of our household, in terms of the intergenerational issues within our households and the people we care for, and our interaction with the businesses and industries or whatever activities we're doing to try to make money and resources, we're the same people. And we're driven by very much fundamentally the same needs and wants. They may change form, but fundamentally there's core deep structural parameters, they're called. And for economists, that means that we have a marginal propensity to do things. We have a marginal propensity to consume and spend. We also have a propensity to save. Some of us are good at it, some of us aren't. But we also know that we need to be ready for the next day in some fashion for the future. These are deep structural parameters. These don't change. They're fundamentally wired in. and they create the demand. The technology can change the delivery, but fundamentally the reassertion will come time and time again. It has done through bigger transformations than AI looks likely of even being able to deliver. Electrification was a much more significant transformation in the past. The internet promised a lot, has done a lot, but fundamentally hasn't changed. It's just a different form in which we consume, we save, we see our knowledge, we interact with our intergenerations. They're deep structural parameters. And on the business side, the production function requires those elements of capital, be it land or space to do it. Maybe that's diminishing in the disembodiment that we're experiencing. I'll come to that term in a moment, the disembodiment of activity. But fundamentally, any enterprise and any leader that talks about the transformative power of digital or AI is still going to have to cope with the issue of the need to bring together the factors of production, be there the natural capital, which we'll see is very fundamental in terms of the raw earth, the raw materials that are required to drive the AI, to drive those chips, require tangibility and resources. You can't magic away these fundamental aspects of reality and analog and real substance. And in addition, you're going to need labor and skilled labor and people who are able to actually use their brain in addition to the models, be they large language models or whatever they may be, and also to take the risk to actually monetize these aspects. So I'm not an expert on digital, but I just want to give some of my observations on these. But those are also deep structural parameters in the business side. The relative weights of labor to capital, the access to resources, the profitability and the margins, and whether it's competitive and whether you have many businesses or you get just some big behemoths of businesses. All of this has come before, different ways. Nothing is changing fundamentally, is my core point here. So the hype about AI and its transformative power is true, but it's not fundamental to humans, despite the kind of nervousness, because it has never been thus. And thus far, people say it's too early to tell yet, but thus far, the labor market consequences of AI is pretty much the same as with the internet of 25 years ago. It'll certainly change, things will look different, but is it fundamentally transformative in terms of how value added is created or not? Well, the jury's out. And I suspect, despite all the hype, you'll see that there'll be a reversion to mean. The reversion to mean is to those deep structural parameters. Now, how do you get to that steady state? Well, first of all, a lot of the promise of technology has actually been quite slow in being delivered. It would have been quite easy 10 years ago to suspect we would be now very heavily in autonomous vehicles. All right, so lots of things aren't coming at the speed at which the hype is out there that this is going to be really transformative. But it is the reality. We are now in a digitalized world. And what does digitalization actually mean? Well, to the consumer, it means they can't see things anymore. We're engaging, the only tangible aspect may be our mobile phone. And it's through that mobile phone that we are procuring services, transacting in that way. So it's a disembodiment. And so the characterization of the last phase is not so much that you use the word analog or digitalization, but increasingly it's about disembodiment. And so it's nebulous and intangible. And this becomes absolutely crucial for societies. And it was mentioned earlier on at the level of the individual, at the level of the firm, when you're dealing with intangibility, you really have to trust. Because intangible, it's got no tangible phenomenon. You need good faith here. Those of you of a religious dispensation. You're dealing with a world that's actually been in transubstantiation, moving from tangible to intangibility. And in that move to intangibility is what are the actual trust aspects to be relied upon here, is how do you trust what you're doing with your own data, what's actually been delivered to you, is it being delivered in a way that is socially acceptable? I know in the last 6 months as I started using either Copilot or Gemini, is that when I start to search, I'm not using Google as much anymore, I'm lazy, I'm asking AI to do it, I know that that search is a multiple impact on the environment as a result of doing that. All right? So that has consequences that's actually changing some of our social structures as well, in terms of the race that is on between the United States and China. And Europe is kind of caught in the middle, laggard in the middle, is that we're seeing that that is actually driven by the consumer type behaviors that's putting this intangibility, but it's not actually intangible when it comes back to those deep fundamental factors. It still requires resources around electricity, for energy use, for the critical minerals for the chip production and so on. And therein lies the danger of the digital innovation, is that it's not linear in the sense that it's just a continuous improvement. There's also a bending back in terms of the threat that this disembodiment that we've just had the benefit of for the last number of years, the intangibility, requires something where there was a word that accountants used to use, was on a balance sheet of a firm. The intangible asset on the balance sheet for a firm used to be called goodwill. And goodwill is that intangibility that a business has, or you as an individual, or you as a family unit have. The intangibility is your brand, or your patent, or your copyright, or your license, or your good name. And in that good name and goodwill towards you, a lot of good stuff can happen because you're trusted. And so whilst on one dimension, the revolution in digitalization and artificial intelligence is delivering us stuff faster and access and breaking distance, we're also in the moment in time where the goodwill is very quickly beginning to turn towards bad will. And that's why what the messages earlier on this morning was really important about the relationship with customer, because what you're building is trust and goodwill. And these things don't go out of fashion, even though they may seem to be in a kind of a technocentric kind of movement forward. It is actually the underpinnings of our society is based upon that goodwill. So we're observing internationally is a reversion away from a period of trust and goodwill in multilateral organizations. But even more fundamentally, when we look to the United States, we see something even more significant occurring, which is because goodwill can go a long way in terms of the informality of relationships between a business and between customers. But things go wrong, and so where do you mediate the solution when things go wrong? You rely on the legal system. And so capitalism and socialism, but capitalism being the dominant form of redistribution and value creation, is fundamentally requires strong property rights that can be universal, transferable, exclusive, and enforceable. And they require the rule of law and social conventions codified or perhaps delivered like we have in our society along the United States and Britain, not codified, but in a common law legal system of interpretation and precedent. And so the digital transformation in itself is creating new precedents that it's difficult to actually codified legal systems really find it difficult to keep up with revolutions, because if it's not codified, how do you actually move fast? It's no small reason that the United States, Ireland, and Britain before their midlife crisis of Brexit, were really the receptors of these intangible assets that came to our society. But when the legal underpinning of a society starts to change, and you see the dramatic movements, particularly in the United States, where the government is even taking equity in companies like Intel, NVIDIA, Japanese trade deals with the government, the US government is saying they'll take profit. What you're seeing is an erosion here of those fundamental characteristics that I talked about in terms of trust and in terms of goodwill. Conscious of time, I want to move on to maybe a bit out of that kind of aspect, but a very crucial one, is what happens next? Well, one of the features we've got to acknowledge in our society, in Ireland, is that that world in which I've just described, where disembodiment and intangible assets were the driver of value, were transformative to our economy. Our society has transformed in the last half a generation in a spectacular way. It is only 15 years ago that we had 1.8 million people in our workforce. Today we've got 2.8 million. No society has experienced the type of 15 years we've just experienced in terms of change. Economic activity, by a much maligned measure of GDP, inaccurately maligned as it happens, but it's the signal, not the noise. GDP has actually doubled from the base year of 2014, grew by 100% to the edge of COVID. And since COVID, it's increased another 50%. The Irish economy is 150% higher than it was in 2014, with 1 million extra people working. Household wealth in Ireland is also grown spectacularly. Last night in the Irish banking system, Irish households had 167 billion euros on deposit. 167,000 million on deposit. Practically ATMable. If the machines worked enough, we could have a good time in Castlebar last night. That's stunning compared to other societies who are struggling at the moment with public finance issues and poverty, because we were the beneficiaries of this digital innovation and movement, and the movement of corporate balance sheets, but also substance in terms of the tangibility of the industrial base here in Mayo that we talked about earlier on, in terms of now AbbVie, used to be Allergan, but the Botox and Coca-Cola, etc., going through the brands I mentioned earlier. And that's just the cash part. But that works out on average of about 80,000 euros for the average Irish household. I've never met a household, everyone goes, not us. Yeah, but the reality is, if it's not us, there's another room the same size as this with the people who have it, who are also our fellow citizens. And that wealth generation has come from this digital revolution and this embodiment, and been in the right place at the right time. And it's arguable that Ireland is actually the beneficiary of a form of colonization. There's a trigger word. That we might be the colonizers. Because what the colonizers do, well, they took tangible assets from other jurisdictions and used it in their own societies. And we had lots of empires that were built upon colonization and taking assets that might be in other jurisdictions. In the modern world, lots of countries would think that Ireland has actually colonized the intangible assets and are benefiting spectacularly from those assets when they look at their household wealth. Never mind the government's wealth for a moment. But we also see it in the corporate side as well. Corporate balance sheets are very strong in Ireland. High with cash content as well. And the reason you know this is true is that any in the financial services, be they your credit unions to your banks, nobody wants to borrow. They don't want to borrow. Debt in Ireland is now down to 100, at the household level, is down to 157 billion euros. There's more cash in the 167 than there is the debt. And so this wealth effect, driven by this digital innovation, is among us. And then the government is also unique in Europe to be running budget surpluses on a continuous basis, and our debt, to whichever ratio you like, is much lower than elsewhere. The other part is, again, knowing the facts, the situation as and how we deal with the future, is the wealth in Ireland is also incredibly well distributed relative to other societies. In fact, on those wealth statistics, the 167 billion is only the cash. The average Irish house unit now is about 400,000 euros. It's about 2 million of them. So there's 800 billion of housing wealth to go with that 167. And then there's about another 500 billion of other savings in pension funds, in equity, or whatever. So there's 1.5 trillion euros of assets owned by Irish households, and their debt position, as I said, is about 157 billion. So net clear, there's 1.3 trillion. This is a phenomenon that has actually just occurred in the last 10 years on the back of the digital innovation. So it's not alone that our individual experiences are being transformed by this digitalization. Our whole society and our whole economic model has been transformed by this. There is no place on earth that has been uniquely favored by the world of what we're talking about here at the individual and corporate level. What's the conscious of time? Last point. Let's start. So that's kind of a positive glow. Two things to say for the future, and particularly to the students here. The future is very positive, being digital natives. Huge advantage. However, do put a bit of time into the analog world, because the capacity in the analog world is very, very significant to be able to tangibly see the shapes of what I've just been talking about. Because otherwise, in the disembodiment, it's very difficult to have a perspective, because very soon the scarcity of being digital native is disappearing. And on a kind of a serious note for university education, but not a fatal one, as we speak today, the premium for university education, the wage premium, is gone. It's zero. First time in generations, because we've got an excess supply of graduates. And what we don't have is people who do tangible things in terms of the apprenticeships in plumbing, electricians, etc., a whole host of things that actually matter significantly and are tangible. So don't get completely lost in the intangible. The analog is actually very significant as well, and it's a deep structural parameter that won't go away. So there is a kind of a bit of a overly exaggerated hype. And then the last piece in all of this, I told you I'd get sentimental in the end, is that in my lifetime in the labour market, I've witnessed what I think are three phenomena. In the 1970s, 1980s, when I grew up here in Connacht, tangibly, the most common work aspect were people's hands. You could see what they were up to. You could see what they were doing. There was some white-collar people, pen pushers or whatever, but most people, it was tangible. They're in a factory, they're in a farm, they're in a shop. Their hands were moving. You knew they were working. Then we had a generation where we over-indexed on maybe white-collar, and that was all about brain power, channeled by our educational system and so on. So if AI is going to take out some of the brain power, or digitalization is going to take out some of the brain power, where does it go next? I would argue that places it's going to go next is to the heart. See, I told you I was going to get sentimental. By the heart, I mean here courage, the core. The French term for the heart is core, hence the root of the word courage. And having that courage to actually see the labour market as it's evolving and think about things will go to the heart. So what do I mean by the heart? I mean about caring. And yes, I do mean about caring in the way the word triggers to start with, about caring for the young, the sick and the old, a very significant part of the value-added chain to the future. But caring is also about advising, coaching, mentoring. This is where the value-added is going to be. Brain power and hand power are going to be replaced by this care. And of the three, if digital innovation does as it says, the least of the three will be the brain. So you're going to have to be relying more on your hands and more on your heart than you think about. Thank you.